So, what are some of the key factors behind the proliferation of these scam centers? We spoke with Pia Oberoi, the Senior Advisor on Migration and Human Rights at the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Well, as you know, the whole situation has arisen through the COVID pandemic, when there were people that were, being brought into these centers. The main issue is that it's an incredibly profitable industry, and so it has grown and developed as a result of these profits. I mean, there's more than or something close to $40 billion that are being made, by the criminal industries through this. So there's a lot of pressure, in a way, to keep these profits rolling in. And so over the years, we've seen that in places where regulations are lax, such as you mentioned, in Myanmar, along the Thai-Myanmar border, in Cambodia, in Laos, that it's a very sticky industry, and people have been cycled through as victims of trafficking, and the scams themselves are incredibly profitable to the criminal industries. So we're seeing that it's something that has not gone away, even though there has been attention in the past, and there is, as you say, still a lot of attention from the political authorities to try to clamp down.
What do we know about these culprits behind these scam centers? I mean, how do they manage to recruit, exploit victims, and ultimately sustain these operations?
Well, I think in many ways, the reasons that people are being recruited into the scam centers, to start with, is just a problem that we're seeing an economic downturn in many places. Young professionals are finding that they are not, able to get the kinds of jobs that they would like. So there's a vulnerability to the kind of fraudulent recruitment that we see. Another factor is that labor migration pathways in the region have been relying in a lot of senses on a kind of a very inadequate brokerage and recruitment model. So when you're being approached as a professional that is looking for opportunities outside your country, you don't know in many ways, whether the recruitment is fraudulent or not, because brokerage industry around labor migration has been very problematic for a long time. The methods that the criminals use to recruit people into these scams are incredibly sophisticated. So you have, multiple layers of interviews. You have people that have been flown within their countries to, big city centers to have interviews conducted, to test their skills. So it's very difficult to know, as a person looking for a job, whether you're being recruited into something that is legitimate or into these scam centers. And so this is where we see that the criminal enterprises, as a result of the profits that are being brought in, have been able to prey in a lot of ways on the vulnerability of job seekers.
It sounds incredibly elaborate. Pia, the Thai army, they've said in the past that those who are rescued from these scam centers, they undergo questioning to determine if they really were victims of human trafficking. That seems a bit difficult. How do you distinguish between the perpetrators and the victims in these situations?
Well, one of our concerns has been that, in fact, there is not, and without prejudice to the fact that the Thai authorities and in certain circumstances, the other country authorities have been making efforts to try to screen and identify people that have been brought in through these rescues and releases. We're concerned that there is not a systematic screening and identification for vulnerability. And that in many cases, the best case scenario for the people that are released from these centers is a speedy deportation back to their home countries without an investigation as to what kinds of abuses they might have suffered, if, for instance, that they are being recognized as victims of trafficking. Now, this means that we're seeing, many thousands of people that are, for instance, as I said, in a best case scenario, being returned to their countries, but without any proper rehabilitation. You will have seen from some of the media reports that there are incredibly high levels of violence in these centers. People are being released, with physical injuries, mental trauma. And the concern is that despite the high numbers of victims that we're seeing, we're not seeing people being identified as victims of trafficking. And we're not seeing what we call the non-punishment principle being identified and implemented, which means that many people that are released from these centers are then re-victimized in a sense by being subject to immigration detention, by being subject to deportation. And in a worst case scenario, we're actually seeing people being re-trafficked once they've been released, that they've been actually taken back in by the criminal gangs into the centers.
Pia, so how can individuals protect themselves from falling victim to these scams? I mean, what are the most common red flags to watch for, when considering job offers or investments online?
Well, again, like I said, I mean, it's very difficult to know. And from an individual perspective, one of the problems that we've seen through the recruitment system is that often people are being recruited by people that they know, by people in their communities, by friends, by agents that they've been referred to. And as I said, it links very much into the problems with pathways, with kind of governance pathways into labor migration more generally. One of the concerns that we have is that in many of these countries, in Cambodia, in Laos, and Myanmar, that there isn't a vibrant civic space, and the civic space is not being protected. So that the whistleblowers, for instance, that might be able to raise specific information about how these scams are operating are themselves being targeted by the authorities. We've seen the journalists have been detained and arrested for reporting on this. NGOs and CSOs are not being funded. And so that kind of removes, in a sense, the scrutiny around the issue when you don't have a vibrant civic space, when you don't have a free and independent media. So these are the kinds of more structural issues that should be being paid attention to, in addition to a law enforcement response. We of course, accept and very much support a stringent law enforcement response, but there should be a holistic, multi-stakeholder attempt to really bring more direct information to people that might be vulnerable to being fraudulently recruited, as well as broader rule of law interventions to ensure, for instance, that the corruption and collusion at very high levels that we're seeing in these countries is being addressed meaningfully.
That was an interview with Pia Oberoi, a senior advisor at the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And we have more coverage on the worsening problem of human trafficking and online scams in Southeast Asia across our CNA platforms. I spoke with our correspondents May Wong and Saksit Sayasambut in a podcast. It's available to hear on our website, cna.asia, or Me Listen apps, as well as on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.